Good evening. I brought with me 130 photos, which I asked to have just kind of scroll through on the screens. And some of them are funny, some of them are just from my travels. But if you have questions about them at the end on certain photos, just ask me and I'll elaborate. So I'm happy to be here with you, adventurers. I have done a lot of adventuring of my own, and I did it all pretty much through the US government, which was kind of fun. And that's mostly what I'm going to talk about. There are, according to the internet, which never lies, 195 countries. And I sat down and counted them out with little hashtags, and I have been to 80 of those 195 countries. I started out in Germany. I was born in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, which some of you may know is the home of the 1936 Winter Olympics. And why would I be born in Garmisch-Partenkirchen? Well, my father was assigned there at the time. He was learning Russian. And then I lived in Frankfurt, and I lived in West Berlin. I lived in Berlin when the Berlin Wall went up. Most people talk about remembering the wall coming down. I remember it going up. And then we lived in Ethiopia. And then after that, we kind of had a long dry spell, and we stayed in Virginia. We were supposed to go to Munich at one point, and we would have been there in 1972 when they had the Olympics there, and they had the Israeli incident there. So it would have been an interesting time to be there, but that wasn't to be. So I would say that most of my travel, as I said, was from, and then I got a job with the government, but I'm kind of getting ahead of myself just a little bit, because what I want to talk about first is, we all love to travel, and there's usually some pivotal moment that causes us to think, wow, travel is really great. And that was when I was living in Ethiopia. In 1967, we had R&R, rest and recovery, rest and recuperation. I always forget what the two R's are, travel. And we went on this amazing vacation. We went to Athens, we went to Beirut, we went to Istanbul, we went to Asmara when it was still part of Ethiopia, and then we went to Kenya. And I thought, wow, this is really great. And we just did a little bit of everything, and it was, it was very eye-opening for me. And so, I really enjoyed that a lot. And we saw a lot of things, did a lot of things, ate a lot of strange foods. It was the first time I ever had lobster. My father always joked that that was the most expensive mistake he ever made. We had gone to dinner, and he said, Edna, you can order whatever you want on the menu. And I said, oh, I want to try this lobster. And it was so great that I said to my dad after I ate the lobster, I said, I'm never ordering anything else. So there are a lot of pictures of me eating lobster growing up. And while I was in Ethiopia, I was very fortunate that I attended the American Community School for 2 years, and it was the first 2 years that the new school was built. And Haile Selassie was the emperor of Ethiopia at the time, and he donated the land to the Americans to build the school. So our second year there at the school, Haile Selassie came around to the school, and he came and visited every classroom. And we all got to line up, and I was always the shortest. And so I was like one of the first ones that he got to, see. And the child that spoke the best Amharic got to say something to him, like, welcome to our classroom. And I was really insanely jealous that I had the second best Amharic, so I did not get to shake Haile Selassie's hand. But, those things happen. So that school in Ethiopia, the American Community School, really has one of the more active alumni associations for American community schools and DoD schools. Another one that's very popular is like New Delhi's is very big. But I have been back to Ethiopia with the Alumni Association. In 2015, a group of us went for I guess that would have been the 50th anniversary. And it was pretty cool. We got VIP treatment, we got tours of the city, and we got to go back and try to find our old houses. Mine, of course, had been torn down, and there was just a hole in the ground. So I took a picture of the hole, but it wasn't very exciting. But anyway, so we go back to the States, and I'm going to high school, and then I decide that rather than go to a four-year college, I'm going to go to the community college, and I'm going to study a very important skill. I'm going to study secretarial science, because then I knew I would have a marketable skill, and I would be able to get a job. So I'm at Northern Virginia Community College studying my secretarial science, and the CIA recruiters come to our school. They say, we need secretaries. And I go, oh, wow, a government job where I wouldn't have to work in Washington, D.C. I could work in Virginia, and they might send me back overseas, which I just love doing with my dad. So I raised my hand, and I told the recruiter, I'm interested. Can I come in for an interview? And they said, absolutely. So this was 1976. So back then, if you were applying for a job at the CIA, you went to this very nondescript building in a place called Roslyn, Virginia. Has anyone ever been there? It's just like right across the Key Bridge from Washington, D.C. So I go in there, and I have this interview, and I obviously did a pretty good job, so they hand me this 17-page application form to take home and fill out. I was still living with my parents at the time. So I come home and I go, Dad, look at this application. Look at all these questions they want to know. He goes, let me have a look at that. And I said, okay. And so he goes, you see this question here? And I go, and it was about, do you have any friends or relatives that are employees of the CIA? And I said, oh, yeah, I know your brother worked there for a while, didn't he? And he goes, no. And he's giving me this funny look. And I go, well, what are you talking about? He goes, I worked there. And I went, what? I had no idea. And then all of these things that had never made sense to me, it was like this huge light bulb went on over my head. The first thing was, we lived in a town called Vienna, Virginia. And my dad's cover job was that he worked for the Department of the Army in the Pentagon. And I would say things to him like, if you work at the Pentagon, why don't you carpool with the guy right across the street who also works at the Pentagon? Why are you carpooling with some guy that lives like 3 blocks away? And then I would say things to him like, well, when we were overseas, we could always go in your office. Why can't we come visit you at the Pentagon? And, you know, he must have hated me with all these questions I used to ask. And then I realized, you know, my birth certificate, which says that my father was an Air Force civilian, lie. My sister, who was also born in Germany, but she was born in Berlin, hers says U.S. Army civilian. So my poor dad couldn't even keep a job, or so I thought. And in fact, when I had gone to Roslyn to pick up that application form, I walked in that building and I said, I feel like I've been in here before. It just seemed really familiar to me. So I asked my dad, I go, have I been in this building before? He goes, yeah, that's where we had to go get all our shots when we went to Ethiopia. And so all this stuff that had just never been clear to me, all of a sudden was, you know, it was all made sense. So I ended up not being hired right away. I had another job, also with the federal government for 2 years, not important, didn't do any traveling then, but that government organization was shutting down. So I was looking around for a job, and I reapplied to the CIA, and I got picked up right away. And I was like, I'm ready to go. And so, of course, they put me in some dumb office where I'm working in the Office of Security. I'm not even working in the main headquarters building. And I'm like, but I want to go overseas. I said, and I love Africa. And they go, you do? And I said, oh, we got a live one here. And so they grabbed me up and they sent me to Africa Division. And I have to stop here to say that when I started working in Africa Division, I couldn't believe how cool it was. And this building reminds me very much of Africa Division, because CIA's Africa Division back in the 70s looked like this. There were all these animal heads on the wall and animal skins, so it was kind of fun. So anyway, I get in and I start working, and I'm telling them I want to go overseas, and they finally find me an overseas position. And I should tell you a couple of things, because I'm going to bring this up a few times, and that is that the CIA has a lot of rules. Some of their rules, I think, make a lot of sense, and I will abide by them. Others, I think, are a little dumb, and and one of them is that they don't like us to tell people where we served, because in theory, we're admitting that the CIA had a clandestine presence in these countries. Well, it's not a big secret. So, because everybody knows we're out there. So anyway, I'm getting ready to go over to my first posting in a country we'll call Senegal in West Africa. And they speak French there. So they said, okay, we need to test your French ability. I go, oh, don't worry. I took French in high school. I speak excellent French. They said, well, we'll be the judge of that. So they sent me over to the language school to take the French test. It was probably one of the most embarrassing days of my life. They said, okay, and they started an easy little conversation with, hello, how are you? And then I just kind of was like the deer in the headlights. I just couldn't answer any of their questions. And they said, well, can you say, the dog wags his tail? And I said, sure. Le chien wague son tail. I mean, I didn't know. And so it became very clear that my high school ALM French about où est la bibliothèque was just not going to cut it for the CIA's language program. So they did send me to language school. And I did get pretty good at my foreign languages because of that. And I think this is very true. Does anybody here speak a foreign language? Okay, so either you get it or you don't. And some people have the gift and others don't. And I was just one of the fortunate people that, like, I can pick up languages. It's one of my few skills I do have. So I did pretty well with the French. And my teacher was what I lovingly called a World War II bride. So she was, she married some GI in Paris and came to the States, and while her husband was doing whatever he was doing, probably really working at the Pentagon, she taught French. So we learned very correct French, and we used the formal verb, the vous, and then I went off to Senegal. And when I came back, I ran into my French teacher, and I was chatting with her, and she turned to me in pure disgust, and she said, oh, Edna, you speak like an African now. And I don't think she meant that as a compliment. Oh. And my father also was a linguist, and his languages were Russian, German, and he claimed French. And we always had a little bit of a competition to see who was the better French speaker. So maybe, 10 years into my career with the agency, I don't remember where we were, but there was this woman who was a friend of my dad's who was a native French speaker. And she said, your daughter's French is so much better than yours, Russell. So that made me feel pretty good. Because my dad and I always had these little competitions. Like, we had a competition where we wanted to see who'd been to more countries. And my dad, because he loved yellow legal pads, and he made this pulled out 2 pieces of legal paper, and we had to write down all the countries we'd been to. And the difference was 1 or 2, and I was like, I'm going to beat him. So finally, when I went to Sweden, I passed him. So I sent him a postcard from Sweden, and I just wrote the number for whatever it was that I passed him, and then I think I might have written ha underneath it. But anyway. And then another thing that maybe I'm not supposed to tell you, but I'm going to tell you anyway. So the agency really, they like people who speak languages, and they reward you for that. But if you want to get paid for keeping your language at a certain level, you have to test every so years. So when I was nearing the end of my career, I got a call from the language school, and they said, your language scores are expiring. Do you just want to let them expire? Do you want to come in and test? And I said, well, if I don't retest, will I lose my money? And they said, yeah. And I said, oh, I'm coming in and testing. And I literally had 6 months left, but I was like, I want that $60 a pay period. So I went in and retested and got my money. But I promised you on the Adventures website that I would talk a little bit about some of the culture shock. So when I went off to Senegal in 1981, I was feeling very worldly, like I knew everything because, I had grown up in the biz. And so I pack up my stuff, and I was like living in a townhouse with 3 other girls. So I really didn't have very much. And they said, you don't need to bring any furniture. The government will provide that. They'll provide your housing. Just bring your dishes, your pots and pans, and your clothing, and whatever else you may need. So I show up, and what do I have? I have Corelware. Do you remember that? I think you can still buy it. And I thought that was enough. And then I went to my first official dinner, and I was like, ugh, what am I going to do? These people had, 6 forks and 5 knives and a couple of spoons and, lots of plates and lots of water glasses. I was like, well, I don't have any of this. So I had to quickly scramble to get this because, I had to keep up with the Joneses. And so at that point, I'm in Schmenegal. We don't have a lot of stuff to buy, a good economy to buy this kind of stuff. We could buy great French cheese because it was a former French colony, but couldn't buy dishes or crystal. So I go out and I buy all this stuff through the AFES catalog. Do we have any former military in here? Okay, so you know about the AFES catalog. So it's, the Armed Forces. I don't even know what it stands for. But anyway, we had access to that. So I ordered all this stuff. And then between my first and second tours in Africa, and my second tour was in Shmamaroon, somebody broke into my household effects, and they opened every box and destroyed almost everything of my worldly goods. So then I had to rebuy everything a second time. So when I left Shmamaroon, I was like, well, I'm not going to make that mistake again. So I just sold it all and bought new stuff when I went to France. All right, so I get to Schmenegal, and I think, okay, well, I know how to cook. But, I was a single girl living in a townhouse with 3 other girls. What did I know about cooking? And so luckily I had brought with me the Betty Crocker cookbook. And, we all laugh about that, but I'm telling you, Betty Crocker saved me. And I was very lucky that in my building I had some young single communicators, and they would eat anything. So they were my test pilots, and so I learned how to cook using these guys as my guinea pigs. So I was learning. So I would say that, Schmenegal was kind of like a learning experience. I ended up joining and doing a lot of things I would never have done anywhere else. I joined the Dakar Dramatic Society. Whoops, I said Dakar. Now you know where I really was. So I joined their Dramatic Society. I auditioned for the play. I get the lead. I get the lead in a play where I've got to play the mother, and I'm 25 years old. So, they need a lot of makeup to make me look old for that one. They had a inter-embassy softball league, and they said, we need you to keep score. And I said, okay. So I was keeping score for the embassy team. And then all of a sudden, I would get calls on Sundays from the Canadian embassy or the Japanese embassy, and they'd go, are you the girl that keeps score for the American embassy? Can you come keep score for our team? So I would go to these games. I wouldn't know any of the players. They'd all yell at me because I would give them errors for their bad plays, and they'd be like, that wasn't an error. And I go, well, you dropped the ball. Yeah, it was. But anyway, so I learned a lot of things that I didn't know that I was going to learn there. One highlight from that first tour was there was a singles group there, and they said, hey, we're going to go on this big trip to this really nice beach resort. And I said, oh, that sounds like a lot of fun. So I packed my little Samsonite overnight bag, and I put on a cute little sundress and some flip-flops. And we get on the bus at the embassy, and we ride, and all of a sudden we get to the beach. And I go, oh, are we here? And they go, oh, no. This is where we get on the pirogues. And I think you'll see the pictures of the pirogues at some point. They'll cycle through there. And I go, are we going to ride in those? I said, I'm not a very good swimmer. Are there life jackets? No. I said, well, I hope somebody's going to save me if this thing capsizes. So anyway, off we go on the pirogues. And then we pull up to this island, and I go, oh, we're here. And they go, oh, no, this is just a rest stop. And we just kind of walked around this island, and some guy was like mending fishing nets. And I was like, okay, whatever. And then finally we get to the island. And the pirogues stop about half a mile out, and we have to hop out. So of course I said I was in a dress, so I'm like hiking this thing up, and it's very graceful, and I'm, slogging in, and we get in, and they're like little huts. It looks like Gilligan's Island. I go, this is a resort? And then I walk in, and there's no electricity. There were mosquito nets over the beds. And I was like, oh, what have I got myself into? I was like, this was not my idea of a resort. I'm like a five-star girl. I'm not a camper. So then I go, well, where's the bathroom? And of course, they had the buckets with the running water, and you filled the bucket to flush. And then the water that was pumped in was all salt water. I had brought my little designer soap, which wouldn't lather in the salt water. So it was quite the adventure. But the best part of that weekend was I learned to play this very cool game called Uno. I'd never played Uno before. But we were playing by lantern, and I couldn't tell the green from the blue because they were so close in color, if you've ever played Uno. So anyway, live and learn, but I survived. Also, another fun story about being posted to Africa and working for the agency. A lot of the offices had boats. And the reason we had these boats, in theory, was in case we had to evacuate quickly. It was like our emergency evacuation device. Well, on my first post, the number 2 in our office was an avid fisherman. He commandeered that boat on his first day at post, and nobody ever saw the boat again. But the nice thing was that he would go out every morning and he would go fishing. And he would fish, and he'd go out like at 4 in the morning, he'd fish, come back, and he'd leave all the fish with his gate guard. He'd go in, shower, get dressed, have his breakfast, and by then all the fish would be cleaned, and he'd bring it in and share it with everybody in the embassy. So I would come in like at least once a week, and there'd be a little wet piece of newspaper on the corner of my desk, and I go, oh, I guess I'm having fish for dinner tonight. And by then Betty had taught me how to cook with fish, so it was not a problem. So then when I got to my second post in Shmamaroon, we also had a boat, but this boat was like the worst boat ever. It was constantly under repair. And the one time we got to take it out, we go to this beach, and it was nice, but there was tar all over the beach, and I didn't realize that. And I came home, and I had tar all over the bottom of my feet. I was like, how do you get this off? Does anybody know? Cooking oil. Yeah, so I'm there with my Wesson oil, like rubbing it on the bottom of my feet. It works like a charm. So there's your tip for the day. Now, another bit of culture shock that I got over and learning was that, I thought I was, an exotic and, experienced foodie. But I learned that there were a lot of things I had never had before. And it was interesting because when I was in Cameroon, they had a lot of international restaurants in the city I was in. I was not in the capital. And I'd never had Swiss food before. We had this restaurant called Le Chalet, and I learned to eat raclette. I learned to eat fondue. We had another restaurant called Le Lotus, and it was a Vietnamese restaurant. I'd never had pho before. I'd never had Nim Imperial. So I learned a lot about food that way. Years later, I went to Geneva on a short-term assignment for about 2 weeks. And one night we went to dinner, and I still dream about this. It was like the best foie gras that I ever had. And I wish I could find the card for this place because I would send everybody there. It was just like the most amazing, like it was lick the knife good. And I said, I know this is embarrassing, but it's so good. I don't want a single drop to be wasted. And I really was in this very nice restaurant licking the thing. Oh, and then I forgot, also in Cameroon, we had another restaurant that I never went to because I was not that brave, and it was called La Porte Jaune, the yellow door. And I looked to see if it's still open. It is, but it's not the same as it was when I was there in 1983. But they used to serve porcupine, snake, alligator, which I've since eaten, and a lot of exotic meat, which was not my thing. So, but anyway, that started my love of food. It only got better because my next tour was Paris, and the food there is pretty darn good. So, and I still love food. So now when I travel, one of the first things I do is make sure that I take a food tour wherever I go. And it's a pretty fun thing to do. I see you nodding over there, so I think you've probably done a food tour too. But nice bonus of working for the Foreign Service is that you get to go on really great vacations because your friends are posted in other embassies, and we get this embassy housing, and you never have a one bedroom with a sleep sofa, which is kind of what I have now in Las Vegas, but you usually have 2 or 3 bedrooms, and you've got servants that are there, so it's a good lifestyle. So my very first Christmas overseas, I went to visit a friend of mine who was in Nigeria. My Christmas present from Nigeria, I got a amoebic dysentery. That was something I never want to go through again. I got to go to Bamako when this same friend who was in Nigeria a few years later, she went to Bamako. I've been to Lusaka, which is where I went to Victoria Falls. And I think there is a Victoria Falls picture in one of the slides. And it was during the bad season, so it was pretty dry and it wasn't very spectacular. So my friend, to be funny, sent me a picture like 6 months later and said, "This is what you missed." And like she was being sprayed with the water. So I missed that. And then as I got a little more older and advanced and my friends started getting good assignments, I got to go to Rome quite a few times. I got to go to London a few times. And then another highlight for me was while I was in Paris, one of my friends from Paris was transferred to Berlin. I said, "Oh, I really want to come visit you because I lived in Berlin and I started school there. And I remember Berlin." She goes, "Oh, come on, Edna, you don't remember Berlin." And she said, "That was like, 40 years ago." No, not 40, I wasn't that old then. 30 years ago. And I said, no, I remember. And so we got in the car and I told her where everything was, and I found all my houses that I had lived in while I was there, and she was just amazed. But the funny thing was, we went to the Berlin Zoo, and I said, "There's this big gorilla statue named Bobby, and he's right inside the gate." Well, he wasn't there. And she says, "You made this up." I said, "I did not make it up. I know he's here." So I made her go all the way through the zoo. And when we got to the ape house, they'd moved Bobby, and there he was. I said, "I told you." And so anyway, and then when I was on my 5th tour, I was in Ankara, Turkey, and or was that Shmankara? Anyway, I also should tell you I have this very strong love for figure skating. And I found out that the European Figure Skating Championships were going to be in Vienna, Austria. And there was a direct flight between Ankara and Vienna, so I went like kind of on a whim. And I was like, man, this is like the greatest thing ever. I said, I don't care where the championships are next year, I am going, and I'm going to go for the whole week and see the whole thing. Well, guess where they were the next year? Bratislava. And this was like 2001, I think. So not super open or developed yet. Still kind of communist, Cold War-y looking. And but I was like, oh, I'm going to go anyway. And it was my R&R, because Ankara, believe it or not, was considered a hardship tour. So we got a 3-week vacation. So I went to Vienna, and then I went because I was meeting some boy there, which was, another story for another day. And then from there I went to Garmisch. I wanted to go back to see my birthplace, and that was kind of interesting. And then I went to Bratislava, and I was like, oh. And, I stayed in this pretty grim hotel. And then what was interesting was many years later, they held the championships in Bratislava again, and I went back, and I couldn't believe the difference. So they caught up quickly. Then another interesting thing about working for the government and having these nice apartments is not only do you get to go to places, but people come to see you. Now, I'm going to tell you, when I was in Senegal and when I was in Cameroon, I didn't have very many visitors, mostly friends on the continent that were in worse places than me. They would come for the good food and the good restaurants, and so that was not so bad. But then when I got to Paris, it was like a freaking revolving door. Sometimes I would barely get people out the door, and the next house guest would be waiting to come in, and I would just barely get the sheets changed on the bed. People that, I never thought would come visit me. Both of my parents came. They didn't come together, but they both visited me. And then when I was in Belgium, quite a few visitors there, but mostly people who were in Europe and they just wanted to come because Belgium, if you know, is the home of the European Union. And so all the member nations, their airlines fly in and out of Belgium. So there's a lot of great places you can go from Brussels very easily, and a lot of people can come visit you easily. So I did have a lot of visitors in Belgium, and I was there 4 years, so it was a long time to be there. And Turkey, not too many people, but I did have a couple people. And then my last assignment, I was in New York. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about New York in just a second. But New York was, again, like Paris, the revolving door. Because, New York is so darn expensive. Nobody wants to pay for a hotel there. And I'm facing the same thing now being in Las Vegas. I have had a lot of visitors in Las Vegas already because, stay with Edna, save a buck. So I did promise that I would say a little bit more about New York, but what I want to say is, there are certain pivotal moments in our lifetime that, when you say to people, where were you on this date? They all remember and they all have a story. The first one I remember was when JFK was assassinated. I was just a kid. And my mom comes in, we're living in West Berlin at the time, and he had just come to Berlin earlier that year and done the famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which either means I am a limousine or I'm a donut, depending on, who you talk to. But when my mom came in to tell me that President Kennedy had been assassinated, I said, who's he? Is he the president of Germany? I'd never lived in the United States at that point. So it was, very different for me. Whereas most of my friends say, oh, we were in school and we got called out, or they rolled the TV in and we all got to watch it and it was very sad. But, that was not my case. In 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down, I was working at headquarters. And I had joined the agency because I was like an old commie fighter. And, as I call myself a Cold Warrior. So I was like, well, I don't know that these people really are friends, and I don't think I want to fight terrorism. So, I was kind of a little bit at a loss for a couple of years right after the wall came down for a work perspective, because I didn't know, well, what am I going to do? But I figured that out. And then the most recent example is 9/11. So 9/11, I had just been home 4 days. I had been serving in Turkey for 2 years, and the entire summer we had been hearing chatter that bin Laden was up to something. And so the embassy was doing all these really crazy things, like they had changed all the barriers around the embassy. And so what used to be an easy commute to get into the embassy, we would have to go through all this extra security. But, we understood it because, they had already bombed the embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam, and we were right on the street. We had no setbacks, so we were a prime target. So we were pretty concerned about that. So I leave Turkey. I'm home 4 days, and 9/11 happens, and I go, oh, that's what we were waiting for. Well, I was on home leave, and I was supposed to go to New York, was my next assignment. So they called me, and they said, yeah, we need you to wait 6 months. So, I had to scramble, find a place to live, find a job for 6 months. But I did eventually get to New York, and that was, like I said, it was an interesting tour. So that's kind of my background and some goofy little stories about me. And now I would just like to share with you just some amusing anecdotes based on my international travel and things that I may or may not have done. So as you're looking at these pictures, there are several pictures that were not supposed to be taken. There are a couple pictures from offices, and there's one, I think did you see the one where I put the spy face over the guy's I don't know if that one's come up yet, but that was one. It was taken in the CIA's badge office, and I can't believe I still had that one. There's another one of my office in Paris, and I left out the one with the safe because I thought, well, that's really stretching it. And then I had the opportunity because I was working as the desk officer at headquarters for Sudan. And they said, oh, well, you need to come out to Khartoum for area familiarization. I'm like, oh, okay. So I get out there, and I arrive in Khartoum, and they go, welcome to Khartoum. Here are the keys to your armored vehicle. And I'm like, oh, this is going to be a fun week here. So I go to, I think I was staying at the Hilton. There were two hotels, the Falcon and the Hilton. I put the picture of the Falcon on here. It'll come up at some point. Oh, there's the pirogue I wrote in. I can see the pictures here, so. Anyway, so there was the Falcon or the Hilton, and I, again, if I wasn't happy with the Gilligan's Island, you know I took the Hilton as my choice. So there was a big prohibition on taking photos in Khartoum, and I was like, well, to me, that was like one of those rules, yeah, we don't have to follow that one. So there were a couple of us who were there who were on temporary duty like me, and we all had our cars, and the one gal didn't get an armored vehicle. She had this little Honda Accord that had a sunroof. So I said, come on, let's go take some pictures. You drive, I'll take the pictures. So just leave the sunroof open, and every time we want to get a picture, just slow down, and please don't brake suddenly, because I'm going to pop up out of the sunroof and take the pictures. So I must have taken a dozen photos. I never got caught. No policeman ever chased us. There was no international incident. No one died. And I got my pictures of Khartoum. So, you know, you can get away with some of it. And then I talked about how my dad and I both worked for the agency. He retired the day before I graduated from high school. But, I always appreciated the fact that he opened up our eyes to international travel and seeing the world. And I felt like the least I could do was return the favor. So at one point, I was working at headquarters, and I heard that they needed somebody to do a short-term project who was, very low-key, but spoke the language and could go in and out of the country without, raising any eyebrows. And so I said, hey, I think my dad could do this. I said, it would be even better if you could take my mom with him. And it was to a nice country. I said, and my dad, who was a mandolin player, I said he could go and he could have mandolin player as his cover. And they were like, Edna, are you out of your ever-loving mind? I said, no. I said it would be perfect. So we ran it up the flagpole, and this thing got approved. So my dad got a free trip to Europe for a month, and he got to help out. And he was, he did what they asked him to do on this project. And, for me, it was kind of a fun thing to do. And I'd kind of forgotten about this, but somebody recently reminded me. I was like, oh, my God, that was one of my better sneaky little coups that I pulled off. Because I was always up to mischief at the agency because it was such a serious job. You had to have a little fun. So when I retired in 2006, when I turned 50, I went to work as a contractor. And this is when my interest in travel really started, because I had a job where I basically just went around the world, meeting people, conducting interviews, and then coming home. So I was on this trip where I had 2 stops. I had convinced the 2 offices I was working for that it was better for me to just do one long trip rather than fly to Europe, come back to Washington, and then fly to Asia. I said, let me just fly to Europe and then on to Asia. So that's what I did. So I get to Europe, and I'm in this country, and I needed some money, and I go to the ATM, and my ATM card was not working anywhere in town. And I was like, oh my God, this card has never failed me. Well, it turns out it was some glitch with my bank that weekend, but I managed to make it by just charging everything on credit cards during that part of the tour. So that was like, but I was thinking, oh, I'll have to borrow money from somebody, but I ended up not having to. But my onward trip to Asia, I had a very short connection because I left the European country and I went to Frankfurt. And if anybody's ever been to Frankfurt Airport, it's not a small airport. And you can guarantee that when you get off the plane in Frankfurt, when you're on a deadline, you're not going to land at a jetway. You're going to be out in the middle of nowhere, and there's going to be a bus waiting for you that's going to take you back to the main terminal. So I knew this was all happening. And back then, I had a really bad ankle. And I couldn't walk very well because I was always limping. And so when I checked in, I said, is there any way you can have a golf cart meet me when I get to Frankfurt? Because I'm not going to make my connection otherwise. And they said, oh, golf cart, that's problematic. She said, how about if we ask for a wheelchair? I said, oh, okay, wheelchair it is. So I get off the plane in Frankfurt, and of course, I had to wait for the bus, and there's nobody standing there with a wheelchair, nobody with a sign with my name, and I'm like, uh-oh. So when we finally get to the terminal, there's a gal sitting there with a wheelchair, and I go, are you there for me? She goes, I am. I explain the story. She goes, I don't care. Hop in. I will get you to your plane. And I said, okay. And this woman, and I'm not a small girl, and she ran through that Frankfurt airport, and she gets to the security part. She goes, okay. She says, really ham it up when you get out. And she goes, make sure that they know that you're really, crippled. And I go, okay. So it wasn't a hard problem because I did limp all the time. And so anyway, I go through security, and then literally I was the last person to get on the plane. And I had a business class seat, and I go, and there's somebody sitting in my seat. And I'm like, oh, here we go. I get to be Karen. And I go, I'm sorry, but you're in my seat. Well, I want to sit with my husband. I said, well, I don't care. I said, that's the seat I paid for. I want it. And I ended up losing. Lufthansa made me go and take some stupid window seat. I was not very happy. But anyway, so we fly overnight. We get to this Asian country, and we get off the plane. And waiting at the end of the jetway, there's a woman with a wheelchair with my name. I was like, I don't need you anymore. So I just kept walking. And then when I get into the gate area, there's another lady with a sign. And I said, oh, I bet I know what she's got to tell me. Sure enough, she goes, well, your luggage didn't make it. And I was like, okay, well, that became a recurring theme. I used to lose my luggage a lot, so I'm used to always having extra clothes in my carry-on just because of that. So another great trip that I got to have was I was asked if I would come to Rwanda. And I said, yeah, I'll come to Rwanda. I love Africa. I said, but I'm only going to come on one condition, and that's if I can go see the gorillas. And they go, oh, we can make that happen. So, and I had to pay for the extra days that I stayed for that, but I was very happy to do it, except, as I told you, I had this bad ankle. And if you've ever gone to see the gorillas in Rwanda, you don't just walk up to a park and you're there. You have to climb up the side of this mountain. And I was like, oh, this is going to be painful. And they had porters who carried all your stuff, and you had a walking stick. But I complained a lot, and my guide did not like me. And at one point, he called me a princess, and I said, oh, no, I am not a princess. I'm a queen. And so when I got my trekking certificate at the end, it says Queen Edna on it. But I did make it in. It was only an hour. You can only take your camera. They take everything else away from you. So I'm handing over my purse that has my passport, my credit cards, my cash. And I said, well, either it'll be there or it won't. And, it was pretty good. And they said, okay, if we tell you, just have to follow our instructions, whatever we tell you. So at one point, they go, Edna, step back. And I go, okay. So I stepped back, and sure enough, I was standing on a piece of bamboo that the gorilla wanted to eat. So I think that's one of the pictures that's in here. If you've come across the gorillas where he's holding the piece, I had been stepping on it. So there's that. And I mentioned the CIA and their rules. All right, so it is kind of fun when you get to go on all these fun travel for personal things. And so I was going to a figure skating competition in Budapest, Hungary. I was still employed at the time. So I had to get permission from the chief of station in Budapest to spend a week watching the figure skating. And this is kind of pro forma in most countries. If you're going to China, yeah, that's a little bit different. But Budapest, they didn't seem to be too worried. But they always give you a point of contact to call in case there are issues. So I go to Budapest, and I'd been to Hungary a couple of times for either vacations or I think I'd been there for skating previously. So I get there, and I'd been going to the competition every night, and about the third or fourth night, I was on my way home in a taxi, and if anybody's been to Budapest and you know where the Hilton is, it's over on, I forget which side, where the fisherman's grotto thing is. So it's at the top of a hill, and there's a gate, and it's very secured. It's, this walled compound to get up there. And I noticed that the taxi meter is spinning crazy, and I owe like $100, and I'm like, oh no, I'm not paying this. And I'm trying to tell this guy, he's yelling, night rate, and I'm going, no, I've been coming every night, and it's only been $17. And he goes, I don't speak English. So we pull up to the hotel, and I said, okay, I'll go in and get someone who speaks Hungarian. And I open the car door, and he starts taking off, and I've got like 1 foot out the car door, and I'm like, oh no, and he goes, and I yell, stop, and he stopped. He goes, I'm taking you back to the arena. And I'm like, this guy is not going to take me back to the arena. He's going to leave me like in a field somewhere, deserted with, no cell phone, no money, nothing. So I was like, oh, I've got to plot my escape. What am I going to do? So I knew that we had to stop long enough for that security arm to get up so we could get out. So I was like, that's when I'm going to run out. So sure enough, as soon as we pulled up to the security gate, I threw the car door open, grabbed my backpack, and just started running up the hill. And I still had the bad ankle then, so, I was running as fast as I could. But I get to the hotel, and I go running in, and this guy came back. And I go, this guy tried to kidnap me. I was a little bit of a drama queen, I admit it. And so I said, call the police. So this whole thing ensued, and the police did come. And I don't know what came over me to do this, but I go, I'm an American diplomat. I shouldn't be treated this way. What was I thinking? And so next thing I know, they're taking a police report, and they take my passport, and they go, where's your diplomatic passport? I go, well, I'm on vacation. It's at home. And so they fill out this police report, and I have to sign it, and I think, I guess I better call my emergency contact. So I pull it out, and it was somebody I had served with in Turkey, so that was nice. So at least I knew him, and he just laughed. I said, if you hear anything, let me know. I never heard anything, so it all dropped. And I should tell you that I got to pay the $17, and the guy went on his way. But those, again, a rule that I didn't always like, but I was happy I had it in that case. All right, so when I retired for good. So I retired first in 2006 when I quit working as a CIA employee. Then I worked 7 years as the contractor traveling around the world. And then I was completely done. This was the end of 2013. I was taking care of my mother, who was very sick. When she passed away, I settled her estate, and I had a lot of miles, and I had really good status with the airlines at that point. So I was like a global services, if you know what that is. And I had hundreds of thousands of miles, and I had lots of hotel points. And I said, you know what? I'm going to do a round-the-world trip. Has anybody ever done this? This is like the best kept secret. All the airlines, not all the airlines, but SkyTeam and Star Alliance both have this. You buy this around-the-world ticket, and it's much cheaper than if you try to cobble together a trip. And they have a few restrictions, like you have to continue in one direction. You can't backtrack. They limit the amount of stops you can make, but you can be very creative. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go to some places that I didn't make on my travels for work. And other places that I just maybe wanted to go back to because I liked them. So my first stop was Istanbul, and I don't know what I was thinking. I bought 2 carpets. I already had tons from when I lived in Ankara, so I had those shipped home. And then I went to India. I'd never been to India. And so the way I did it was I made New Delhi my stop, and then I bought separate tickets from there, and I did the Golden Triangle. So I went to Agra, and I went to Jaipur, and back to New Delhi. And yes, I did get very sick on the first night I was there from something I ate, and my driver came to pick me up, and I said, I need Gatorade. And he goes, I know where. And he pulled up at some little shack, and sure enough, they had Gatorade for me, and that got me through. So after India, I went to Thailand, and I made it look on the Around the World ticket like Bangkok was my stop, but then I bought a couple of tickets from there. So first I went up to Chiang Mai, which was when I rode the elephant and got to go into the cage with the tigers, and I was really sad when I found out that they sedated the tigers. But it was kind of cool holding that tiger's tail up. And then from Chiang Mai, I went to Siem Reap in Cambodia because I wanted to see the Angkor Wat. Of course, I went on the hottest day of the year, and if you've ever been to Angkor Wat, it's a lot of steps. And you're going up and down, in and out of all those temples. So it was a long day, but it was worth it. It was beautiful. I enjoyed that. Back to Bangkok. At that point, I deserved a spa day, so I had a couple days at the spa. Then I went to Hong Kong because I loved Hong Kong. I'd been there for work, and I wanted to go see my tailor, but that happened to be during Occupy Wall Street. And so then there was Occupy Hong Kong, and I didn't know this, and I go down to go to the ladies' market to go shopping, and the next thing I know, I'm like in the middle of these demonstrations. I'm like, oh, this isn't good. So I got out of there quickly. And then my last stop was Hawaii. And I mean, I haven't been all over the world, but not to too many states in the United States. So I finally made it to Hawaii. So that was my round-the-world trip. So when I retired, I had security clearances the whole time. And as soon as my 2 years were up, and I didn't have a security clearance anymore, and I could do whatever I wanted, and I didn't have to ask anyone or tell anyone or worry that I might not be hired again, I went to China twice, I went to Cuba, and I went to Russia. All I have left is North Korea, so that is all I have to say. So. How did I do? 1 hour. That's pretty good. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
I have two. Do you think that your luggage being lost might have something to do with them worrying about who you are and wanting to maybe check your luggage a little bit more carefully?
In that case, probably not, because my cover was always very clever. It was tourist cover. So I was on a tourist passport. I think it was just inefficiency or short connections. But I don't remember ever losing anything. I had one time where I lost a suitcase, and this was very interesting. Has anybody ever been to Kinshasa? There's a nice place for you, let me just tell you. So I went to Kinshasa, and I had to go on from Kinshasa to Nouakchott, of all things. And the only way you could go to Nouakchott from Kinshasa was to go back up to Europe and back down. So I was really getting the miles on that trip. But Kinshasa, the crime is so bad there that they made you check your luggage downtown, not at the airport, like in the middle of the day. And so I took my suitcase. I'm like, will I ever see this suitcase again? So off I go on my odyssey to get to Nouakchott. So we stopped in Douala, which was my second posting, And they go, do you want to get off the plane? I go, no, 2 years was enough. I don't want to see that place again. So then we go up to, I think I flew into Belgium, and then I had to go to Paris and then down to Nouakchott. My luggage never caught up with me. So it took a month. My luggage went to places I hadn't been. It went to Morocco, and I finally had showed up, and I had given up on it, and I came home one day, and I go, what's that black trash bag on my front porch? And it was my suitcase, and it finally reappeared. And I opened it, and everything was exactly as I had packed it. Not one thing had been touched. I was shocked by that. What was your other question?
So you have this multi-generational Cold War that you've lived, but now you are 15 years post-moment. For you, what are you seeing now that is both surprising or expected?
Well, like I said, when the wall came down, the focus moved from chasing the communists to the terrorism. And I thought that there were too many layers of bureaucracy at that point. And I think that's why it took us 11 years to find Osama bin Laden, quite honestly. It wasn't for me. I got out of doing strict field operations, and I started doing counterintelligence. I don't know how much you know about that, but that's like looking for the bad guys. If you ever watched The Americans, it's the neighbor Stan. It was, that was what I was doing. So it was kind of a fun thing. But yeah, it has changed. It's new targeting. It's Although I would say maybe Russia is still a threat. Maybe China is still a threat.
What did your dad do for the agency, and how much were you guys able to talk shop?
He was an operations officer, and you know, he was like the real Cold Warrior, and he was undercover his entire career, never talked about it. And he was very surprised when I went to work there because things changed, and I was allowed to say a lot more than he was. And I was undercover as well, but when I retired, I said I wanted to remove my cover, so, which I did, so that I could say, stand in front of a room of people and say, I worked for the CIA for 35 years. So, yeah.
So you said you had the degree in secretarial science. Were you hired on in an administrative role? Because you later talk about being a desk officer. Can you tell us a little more about that? And did you go to the farm and do any of that cool stuff?
I can tell you a little bit about it. The CIA back then had an outstanding upward mobility program, and they picked bright, young clerical staff who had potential, maybe who were really good at speaking foreign languages. And they would put them through this upward mobility program, and you became professionalized. And I always used to joke, was I unprofessional before? But so I got out and I was a desk officer, and then, you know, I had that job in Brussels that I just really can't talk about because it was pretty sensitive, but it was a cool job. I did recruiting. And then after I did the recruiting, I was like, I want what?
Recruiting of foreign sources or recruiting?
No, recruiting people to work for the clandestine service. I had a very exciting area to go to. I had the Midwest. And I just told somebody this story the other day. And so I had the Midwest, and one of my states was Michigan. And as you know, in Dearborn, Michigan, there's a very large population of Arabic speakers. And they kept giving me a hard time and saying, Edna, why aren't you recruiting more Arab speakers? And I said, well, I don't know. I'm going to find out for you and let you know. So we went to Dearborn on a fact-finding mission, and we started talking to the Arabic speakers there. And what we found out was the ones who were the Arabic speaker were the parents who came from all these different countries. But their kids were raised in America, and they didn't want to learn Arabic or speak Arabic. And so that's why we were not recruiting out of Dearborn. We were catching the Arab speakers in other states. So, yeah. Yeah, so I did a little bit of everything. But I did get out of the secretarial field between Paris and headquarters. So like the 87, 88 time frame. So only 10 years as a secretary. But I wouldn't have changed that. I loved it. I learned a lot of interesting things.
Other than the World Fact Book, which I find to just be an exceptional resource online from the CIA, what is something that most of us wouldn't know about that we could learn from the CIA that is easily accessible?
That's a great question, which is code for, let me think about how I'm going to answer that.
No secrets, but you know, there's so many interesting things that maybe just it's wrote to you.
So, do you know that we have a museum?
I've heard of it. Where is it?
It's at the headquarters building.
How does one get into the museum?
Probably the best thing is if you know somebody who works there and they're retiring, and you can get invited to their medal ceremony, because then you can take a tour of the building. But that's about it. We also do something called Family Day, which is always like in the fall, and we let family members, you know, come and tour the building, and that's often how people would tell their kids that that's where they were. That obviously wasn't around when Russell was an employee. Maybe he would have done that, maybe not, I don't know. But yeah, the museum's very cool. Originally it was a Cold War museum, but now they've added in 9/11, the Afghan War, and Iraq, and you know, they updated it. That's pretty good. Did you know that Julia Child worked for the CIA? The OSS. I'm reading a book about that right now. That's the only reason I bring that up.
So you mentioned the Americans, and anyone who reads the spy literature hears all about honey traps. Do you have any good stories about? Do you think you were ever targeted Were any of your colleagues targeted by overly amorous foreigners?
No, however, comma. So you remember I told you that I was in Shmanagal and Shmamaroon in the early 80s. There might have been somebody in the same job as me with the name Sharon Scranage, to quote Ken Jeong, look it up. And she maybe fell into the honey trap pot. And she was in the same field as me. And I had come back from Africa, and I had my routine polygraph. And they were asking me a lot of questions about foreign contacts. And I was like, man, what's going on? And then, this broke that she had been providing information to the Ghanaians. And I was like, oh. But I didn't know her. But this is another fun fact. Do you know who replaced me in a job once? Valerie Plame. That's how old I am. Does everybody have their tickets that they got for the drawing?
We're going to do that in 1 second, but I want to present the certificate for you.